community, and we are recording this video to be streamed later. We do different kinds of information sessions about the media psychology program, and today we're going to be doing one in which I share a little bit about my research as a member of the media psychology faculty. So today I'm going to be talking about parasocial relationships. So I will define this on the first slide, although as you will see, I have a little bit of an issue with that term. Parasocial relationship means not quite social relationship or one-sided relationship or almost social relationship. And it's a word that communication scholars back to Horton and Wall, 1956, used to define the relationship that we have between, say, me as an audience member and either a fictional character or, say, the actor who plays the fictional character. I'm working on a paper right now, actually, a theoretical paper in which I talk about how the word relationship to me may be not the best way to describe that. But basically, I have two main lines of research. One is a narrative psychology line, which has to do with popular culture stories and characters and our connections with those and what they mean in terms of our own well-being, social functioning, understanding of ourselves in the social world, and also the meaning that we make from them. Because it's no accident that we are all fans of something, whether we call ourselves a fan or not, and there are different ways of being connected to characters and stories. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm mentioning a book here that we just published in January. By we, I mean Fielding University Press, which is our own in-house university press, and the editor-in-chief is Jean-Pierre Isbouts. And I was the editor of this volume that just came out, and super proud of it, and so happy the university has a press that releases these books. So Jean-Pierre approached me and asked me if I would work on a media psychology book for Fielding University Press. This was in January of 2020. Little did we know the things that were ahead of us at that point, but in our little naive and happy world, we decided, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do this book. And I asked him if I could think about what I wanted the content of this to be. So an edited volume, as you may know, it has an editor who, in this case me, who recruits authors to write chapters on a subject and creates the subject, basically creates the table of contents and recruits the authors, and then literally edits, as in like copy edits, gives editorial feedback to all the chapters, then the authors revise, and then it gets published. And so I had an idea one day on the yoga mat to write this book, and the title came to me, Real Characters. I've always been sort of dancing around this idea of what's real and what's unreal in media. Sometimes in popular conversations about media, we tend to say things like, media characters, they're fictional characters, so they're not real. So that if you have an attachment to one, we might start to question your sanity that you don't understand fiction, for instance. But that's, I argue in many different things that I've written and said, that that's not really understanding what it is, that actually we have, as the fundamental way that the human mind works, we think in stories. And at the sort of simplest level of that, it might be subject, verb, object. That's a story. A person did something with a certain object, or to a certain object, or to another person. A person went to the DMV to get their license renewed. That's a story, it's a simple story. And in the theory of narrative thought by Leroy Beach and his colleagues, they talk about how they're neuroscientists, and they talk about at the brain level, that's the fundamental sort of way of processing things. And so when I say narrative psychology, broadly speaking, it is the study of how humans interface with story, and story includes characters. The word narrative, according to that same theory, actually means the story, like as it was written on the page, but also everything that the audience member brings to it. So And I find this whole thing fascinating. Inside my mind are my memories, including my episodic memories, such as things that happened to me in the past, in episodes, events, but also my sensory memories and other types of memories. And so anytime I'm, say, watching a film, it is evoking in my brain the memories that go along with that. Now, actually watching a story is a fairly complex brain event, as many things are. It may be evoking what McDonald and colleagues call my involuntary autobiographical memories, IAMs. Those researchers studied involuntary autobiographical memories, and what that would be is, let's say I was watching Stranger Things, which is set in the 80s or 90s. Forgive me, Stranger Things fans who probably know the exact year. But that might evoke memories from my own childhood. I graduated from high school in 1988. And so I may be thinking of those pants we wore or met that friend of mine and the things we did and things like that. But it also might be evoking sensory memories, like they're drinking a Coke out of a can. And I remember my teen years doing that, or, whatever it is. So it could be taste, smell, smell is very linked to memory. So we're doing these complex things, and also it's very dynamic, meaning ever changing. So I might be shifting from a connection to a character like 11, the character in the story. I may be empathizing with her in her childhood, how they brought her to a laboratory in the story and were testing her because she had special powers. That might be a metaphor for me for something else. Maybe they tested me as a child for some other thing. So all of these different things are evoked by a story. And so one thing to know about stories is they're very personal. So even if a person says, hey, you think that 11 on Stranger Things is a real person and she's a fictional character, my response as a narrative scholar would be to say, it's not as simple as that. For one thing, it's very personal. I have a connection to her, which is interwoven with my own understanding of the world, memories, attitudes, meanings. And so it's not only about a fictional character, but it's about me. It's about me taking her perspective. To me, one of the biggest findings of this whole area is that greater exposure to fiction increases your empathy or your ability to take perspectives. One might argue that the world needs more empathy or the ability to take perspectives rather than taking a single side. So, for instance, in The West Wing, a show about the cast of characters around the president of the United States and a fictional president, they take pains to present positive Democratic and Republican characters who you empathize with, who you see as friends, who you might connect with. And another big finding from this area is that stories can change attitudes, stories can change perspectives, stories can frame debates. And so if you want to change someone's mind, try going at it through a story. So these are some of the things we talk about in the book Real Characters. As I mentioned, it's an edited volume. So what the big job of an editor is really to conceptualize the idea and then to recruit the best authors that you can. And I'm going to show you what some of the chapters are briefly. You don't have to read each of these. I'm not going to read them aloud, but I'll show you the chapter titles briefly, and then you can see who some of the different authors are and take a look at them in the library or other things that they've written, but they're great authors. Also, I want to highlight that I got the opportunity to have 2 associate editors on this task. Those were Ken Walker and Kimberly Dean, and those are current students in the media psychology doctoral program. So in the larger context, this presentation is about how a media psychology faculty member like myself will work with graduate students. And there's infinite ways to do that, just as there's infinite types of media psychology. I'm just telling you about some of the stuff that I do. But that was great because they got credited as the associate editors of a book project. Ken actually wrote a chapter in the book, so he's also a co-author, just because he started with me earlier on the project. Jean-Pierre wrote the preface, and you can just see, as I said, I'm not going to read you the PowerPoint, but just as an idea of who some of the authors are. For example, Keith Oatley is one of my just heroes in the world of narrative psychology. He's a retired clinical psychologist from the University of Toronto. He's actually British, but moved to Canada. And he has done a lot of study of literature and also of the idea of narrative as a social simulation. So simulation, like a game can be a simulation, a lot of things can be a simulation. It's a simulation of what might happen in your life. And another point about that is that when we say the characters are real, and this is a theme of my work. I wrote a book called, my first book was called How Fantasy Becomes Reality. And I notice I continue those themes. My next authored book was called Finding Truth in Fiction. Actually, well, no, anyway, there's different books in there. I get them confused as to what order they came in. But so truth in fiction, fantasy and reality, real characters. What I'm talking about in all of this is psychological realism. That's a research methods term, and it means in the laboratory you bring people in and the experiences you expose them to are supposed to have psychological realism. That is, they would not necessarily happen in real life just as they happen in the lab, but if they evoke real feelings or thoughts, for instance, they have psychological realism. So even though, let's say for Stranger Things, because it is a sci-fi fantasy show, those specific things don't actually happen in real life, but the relationships evoke real life relationships. And that's no accident because the actors are real. And we forget sometimes, we say it's a fictional character, so it's not real, but the author wrote that, and it's you're writing so that you could connect with people. And of course, authors base their characters on their experience with life, and it's an amalgam. It's not necessarily that one character was exactly a person in their life, but it could be a number of people who had certain characteristics, or one person who has three different people's characteristics wound up in them, but it still comes from a human mind and human experience. And broadly speaking, with all of this, I like to emphasize the word imagination. All of this, our connection with Eleven from Stranger Things, or any character that you want to choose, that is our imagination. And I've talked about it as guided imagination. The analogy I'm using there is if you've ever done a meditation that's a guided meditation, it's a person leading you through a path. Like, let's walk out into a wilderness and you see trees around you and you see sunlight in the branches of the trees. That's a guided meditation, whereas you could do it by yourself and have your own thoughts, not necessarily even words. A story to me is like a guided, it's a guided experience because I'm telling you a story, and so you don't have to create your own characters or scenarios. So I'm going to go on to, we have developmental aspects, emotional aspects. Reba Tukachinsky is a scholar who's known for her work on parasocial romantic relationships. And in fact, I just had the pleasure and honor of reading her entire book on the subject, which is due out, I believe, this summer. And she gave me an advance copy. And in her book, she mentions imagination, and she talks about how we don't sometimes realize this, but even in our quote unquote real relationships, much of that relationship takes place in our imagination. We don't spend, oodles of time with people face to face, especially now, but even in normal times, it may be that you see your friend. Let's say I have a good friend that I see every week or every month. But I think about my friend often. And because we do so much social thinking and social imagining, the sheer amount of time we spend imagining our real relationships is greater than the amount of time we spend face to face in those relationships. And the imaginal part is not unreal. It just comes from the entire premise that a great deal of our human thinking that takes place is social imagination. And many scholars have speculated that that is because we are such social creatures that anytime we're not otherwise busy, what we will do is run through scenarios in our head. And It could be like retrospective scenarios, things that have already happened that maybe we'd like to redo, or prospective imagination, things that might happen in the future, imagining those. And those people have studied the content of daydreams, for instance, and a lot of those daydreams are about people in our real lives, face to face, and a lot of times those scenarios are about characters. So, and they can be a mix of those characters. They're all characters in a sense. We're all characters in each other's lives, and we don't see an absolute real person. We see, again, we see it through our own lens. And so there's my mother, it's my mother's 80th birthday today. Happy birthday, Mom. She's twin, so it's Joan and Jim's 80th birthday today. Well, I see my mom through my own lens. And so my version of my mom is different than my sister's or other people's. So going through the book, we have a chapter on female representation, LGBTQIA plus representation. Pam Rutledge is a Fielding faculty member, and her chapter is about some of the consulting work that she does. In this instance, she's talking about a narrative analysis of audience responses to the film Predator in the teaser. Aiden and Melody are graduates, and yes, nepotism. My husband Lee is an author of a chapter. I actually put this in here. I asked for this to be in here because I wanted some vision of fan perspectives. And Lee, Clarence, and Kyle do a podcast called Discussing Who, which is a Doctor Who podcast, and they're big fans. And my husband's a playwright and a screenwriter as well. But I asked him to, through the eyes of the fans that they have talked to over the years, that they had seen at conventions and other things, who is the Doctor? The Doctor is the main character of Doctor Who. Who is the Doctor, and what is it about the Doctor that is enduring for a fan? And for those of you who don't know, briefly, the actor who plays the Doctor changes over time, and the idea is the consciousness stays the same, but the body changes. And recently, the Doctor is being played by a woman for the first time. And so I wanted to talk to them about that. And actually, Dara Greenfield, who's one of my authors here, and I have been working on a study about when the Doctor became a female with some Fielding students. So that's another example of cross-university collaborations. So there's Ken's chapter about fictional characters changing minds. And Ken, again, my student, he's now approaching his dissertation, and he's very interested in Native Americans and teaching history. He had a Native American studies, I think it was a major or a minor in college, and really wants to use fiction to change attitudes, to be more positive, or to be more educated in that domain. And then finally, David Giles ended the book. And David Giles is noted, he's a British scholar who first wrote a book called Media Psychology. And he's had a couple of updates since then. So I was really thrilled to get him as an author. By the way, I think there's a link in here somewhere, but this summer, the Media Psych program at Fielding was very lucky to do a symposium. And as we were working on the book at the same time, I asked some of these authors to come and speak about their research, their perspective on parasocial relationships, and also what they were writing about in the book. And so I have some nice conversations. One in particular, I just actually posted on social media today. I have a media psychology forum on Facebook that you're very welcome to join. Just look for, it's just, the group is called Media Psychology Forum. And you might see my name in there, but I just posted a clip of a video from that hour-long talk where I asked these researchers who wrote chapters here, what is it we're studying when we study parasocial relationships, and why is it worth studying? And I got some amazing answers from these brilliant minds. So I'm very excited to share that. And, you know, for me as a professor, I think I always notice when students see that the scholars are real people and they're people they could give a talk on video or in person at a conference. And it really does change something when Keith Oatley, like I said, is British, and so is David Giles. And when you hear in their voice, and Keith is retired, and so we come from different sort of age groups and demographics and perspectives, but to hear these different scholars talk about what's important to them and what it is we think we are doing, to me, that's really important. And it is media psychology, because it is hearing someone in a different way. So in the past, like when I was in graduate school, since the email was just starting back in those days, and I remember a sign in the graduate students' workroom that said, "Read your electronic mail," and we were all figuring out what is that. But now, of course, you can see and hear scholars, of course, in person, like you used to be able to. Well, not now, but theoretically. But you can also have access to people giving talks on video. And so even though I have read many works from each of these authors over the years, it was different even for me hearing them speak about it in person. And of course, I had the great position of being able to design and write the questions that I asked them. So just asking them, it's not a question that a researcher gets that often. Reporters would ask different kinds of questions. Students might ask different kinds of questions. But as a peer-to-peer thing where I get to ask them the questions, I ask them, what is it that we're doing? Because sometimes from the outside of science, if I just say, hey, I study parasocial relationships, what is that, right? And it's one of those wonky things that psychologists do to try to make things weird. But it's really fundamental to me, and it's very important to me. So being able to not only ask them to write something specific, so the content of the chapter was something as the editor that I asked them to write something specific for me that maybe they didn't write that angle before, but then in the symposium, I could ask them the questions that I wanted the answers to, and I was just blown away by some of their responses. So as another example of faculty-student collaborations, I worked a lot with a student, former student named Cynthia Vinny, who's now graduated. We did a lot of research, published a fair number of articles together, and we came out with a book in 2020 called Finding Truth in Fiction. And as just a little bit of info about what we wrote about in here, and I can tell you about the collaboration process too. So Cynthia and I met weekly for years while she was a student and after. And we would talk about whatever research projects we were working on, what were the next steps. And she's always been a stellar scholar. She came through our master's program and then took the doctoral program. And we would talk about different things that we wanted to research. And we wanted to write this book. So I teach about the process of getting a book accepted at a publisher and all that stuff. So I shared with her what I knew about that. And we decided what we were going to do is basically divide up the chapters. And being the first author, I think I might have taken one more chapter or something. And so we each wrote the chapters on our own. And then we traded chapters that we had written, and then we edited each other's chapters. And so it was a back and forth like that. And the book goes through a bunch of different processes. Like this is from Oxford University Press, and they have a process by which you sort of pitch the book to your editor, and then you write one chapter, and then you write a table of contents, and then that gets peer reviewed, and you get your peer reviews back, you make changes based on that, and then the publisher decides whether or not to publish it. So we went through that whole process, got this book going. We were working on it I always joked, we were working on this book since childhood. I think she's 7 years younger than I am or something. So since my childhood, I don't know, but her childhood. But we worked on it a long, long time, and it just came out in 2020. And one of my quote unquote chapters, the one that I wrote, one of the ones I wrote first, was chapter 3, which is called On Actors and Their Roles: The Social Psychology of Narrative Person Perception. So if you take a course in social psychology, one of the main classic areas of social psych is called person perception, which is just how we understand other people, who they are, what to expect from them, what's their personality. And so what I do in this chapter, I go through the process of how do you understand who a person is when that physical body is an actor, but they also represent a character. And maybe it's in the cases I talk about in the book, maybe it's a character that they're famous for. I drove Cynthia crazy because I have a ton of ideas about Star Trek. And so she literally edited out several of my Star Trek references. And I have been known to show a 1960s shirtless William Shatner at the drop of a hat. So anyway, I would talk about William Shatner. Okay, how do I understand who William Shatner is as a person? He played Captain Kirk in the original series, arguably the main character from the story. And then how do I understand who he is as Captain Kirk? Does Captain Kirk exist? Is that a thing? Does it have a reality? How do fans understand those things? And I wasn't trying to give one answer because I don't think there's one answer. What I was trying to do is be a media psychologist, a person who studies the social psychology of media, and say, look, we look at a body, William Shatner's body, and we say, oh, that is Captain Kirk. But I know it's also William Shatner, but then what's the difference between the personality of William Shatner and Captain Kirk? And is he also Denny Crane? And he's also TJ Hooker? Like he's played a number of roles that are well known. So then how do you make sense of that? That's the sort of psychology that I was going through there. And how it is, even for people who would say, yes, rationally, I know that William Shatner is an actor and that Captain Kirk is a fictional character. I still, that's my rational vision of that. But still, if I were to be transported back in time to the 1960s and see William Shatner as he was in the original series, I would say that is also, I'm doing the Captain Kirk, that is also Captain Kirk. I get frustrated because sometimes journalists will take the angle of fans are mentally unhinged or delusional or something. And like, I think William Shatner is Captain Kirk, so I'm going to start stalking him or something. But you have to sort of put that aside. It's much more complicated than that. And it's much less insulting in reality than that. I had this comment in there. I had picked out fan comments from a lot of different franchises. This one was from the film Titanic. When Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet were together at an awards ceremony, their fans were tweeting, for instance, these two, does anyone else see Leo and Kate together now and feel relief from the emotional trauma of Titanic? And another fan says, Kate and Leo won tonight. It's still real to me, damn it. Well, yes, we know that they're fictional characters from the film Titanic, and we know that those two are actors. But yet they told us a story, and it was a very compelling story. And also in that case, it's intertwined with history because the Titanic sinking is a real story. So it gets complicated in the brain. And my friend and colleague, Gail Stever, who is one of the co-authors of, who's the author of one of the chapters of Real Characters, she was one of the first people that I recall reading her work, and it said, you know what? Most fan behavior is normal behavior, but we see highlighted the abnormal behavior. And it is indeed abnormal. There are certainly abnormal behaviors. As you probably know, there's a large clinical psych program at Fielding, and some of our folks live in the LA area. And so I've had faculty colleagues say to me, they have clients who are stalking a celebrity. So of course that does exist, but it's not the average type of behavior. In social psychologists, we study quote unquote normal behavior, including harmful behavior. Aggression is a topic of interest in social psych, and prejudice, which is another area I'm interested in. That's a topic in social psych. So me as a social psychologist, I teach social psychology at Fielding to the whole School of Psychology. And so I'm teaching just theory, not specifically related to media. I try to keep very, very little media psych in there to keep them differentiated. And then I teach classes that are the application of social psychology to media. So I would start with the theories like Susan Fisk's theory, the stereotype content model, Fisk and her colleagues like Amy Cuddy and Peter Glick. And then I would say, okay, so that's what psychology knows about stereotypes. How can I use that information to make predictions about stories about groups of people? You know, a stereotype is an idea about a person because they're in a group. Any group or any overlap. A Black woman is the intersection of two groups. So how do I take the theory of social psychology and then apply it to mediated situations like stories? And so that's what I do. I try to engage students in research as much as possible in different kinds of writing. And then, as I mentioned, of course, I also teach these graduate seminars in topics related to social psychology in the media. So I have actually spoken for longer than I intended to, which I do tend to do. So I'm going to pause here and open it up for any questions or comments that you might have.